why I'm going to charge like something small for the articles is it's been months of research into this, months of research. And um, it has not been easy to find scientific academic research on why the IT industry is doing poorly. The problem that I'm trying to get through is that any time that this argument comes up with me, it always becomes subjective. It always becomes anecdotal. Well, I had an experience and it was good or bad. Well, I feel this way because I did this or that and it worked out for me or it didn't. And therefore, insert some kind of conclusion here. And it's always anecdotal. So where's the data? Because if it's all subjective, if your perception of whether the IT industry is in good shape or not is purely subjective based on how you feel, then I feel that it's not good. And so what makes my subjective experience any more qualitative than yours or more authoritative than yours? Honestly, it doesn't. Who cares? Who cares what your subjective experience is? And that's kind of what I'm getting to in this particular stream. It kind of centers around this big thing of developer experience. And I've already talked about cults on a back-end banter episode. If you don't know what that is, it's from boot.dev. Lane Wagner does a podcast. It's called Back-End Banter, and he interviews people. And he was kind enough to let me on and talk about my experiences in the industry. I got fired for using HTMX. And I talked about this in brief. I've been around cults for a long time, most of my life. I know how they work. I've seen them inside and out. And developer experience, I talk about cults here, for example. That's why I have this up. But developer experience is absolutely, in my opinion, it is absolutely a cult. Or at the very least, it lies on a spectrum of cult that leans towards more of a definitional cult than not. And the reason why is because it relies mostly on your feelings. So here, an example, if you want to take it to the extremes. Someone can have a very good developer experience writing very poor code, and someone can have a very bad developer experience writing poor code. The person who has a good experience, which is essentially the feeling, how do I feel as I write this poor code? The person who has that good feeling ends up thinking that something they did was right. It overrides their logical faculties. That's how cults operate. Cults operate on referencing your feelings and accessing those in vast superiority to accessing your logical faculties. When people think logically while they're inside of a cult, they tend to find their way out of the cult. When people feel things inside of a cult, they tend to stay in the cult. Because as long as the cult keeps you feeling a certain way, it's maybe related to dopamine, it may be related to other, whatever you want to call it, chemical systems. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is, when you're feeling good or you're feeling negative about something, the cults win. The whoever is operating the cult essentially has you captured. So typical things about cults will be like othering, where other people outside of your cult are basically oppressive. So you might be the guy who really loves, again, I'm picking on React here, but it could be like, let's attack me for a moment. I'm the guy who loves HTMX, right? And so let's say I'm in an HTMX cult, and the cult tells me that anybody who comes to me and says, listen, Spiro, HTMX is leading you down a dark path. All right. It's not a good framework. It's doing harm to you. Do you really believe in HTMX? Why don't you do React? Why don't you try React? And my immediate feelings-based approach to answer that would be, well, I feel good when I use HTMX. And you're an other. You're not in my group. Therefore, I can make a bunch of assumptions about you. A typical thing that cults like to do is when they other people is they'll go, well, they're crazy. They have crazy ideas, and so anything they say to you, you can disregard. And so I can say, well, someone who's coming to me recommending React, trying to get me off of HTMX, really is just trying to ruin my life. And I don't have to listen to anything they say because they like React, which means that they're insane, because that's what my cult leaders have told me to believe, that React developers are insane and I shouldn't listen to them. And those are feelings that override your ability to think logically about what you're doing. Now, developer experience does have value, and it has like objective value. So, for example, a common argument that I hear back against my preachiness about like frameworks and libraries and not using them is, well, what do you want us to do, Spiro? You want us to go back to assembly? And, partially my response is, sure, why not? Tell me why that's bad. And of course the answer would be like, geez, man, it'd take forever to do anything. People would have to like understand so much more than they do now. It opens up the door to a lot more issues, etc., etc. And to be fair, that's actually a pretty good argument. I don't actually want people to go back to assembly. I don't actually want that. But there is some kind of a balance here, and I feel like we've lost our way. And all we do is we focus on what the developer wants, how the developer feels as they're generating code. And this doesn't just happen in developers or with developers or in the developer community. This also happens in companies. But this is the thing, is once you start thinking through the steps of why developer experience matters and to whom it matters, the reasons for why developer experience matters change based on your frame of reference. And it's almost always feelings-based. And therefore, to me, it's extremely culty, if not fully cult. Anybody who has an immense, or I don't know what you would call it, it's like an overpowering urge to focus on developer experience is probably focusing a lot on their feelings. Now, I actually think that there's a systemic problem. The reason why a lot of programmers focus on their feelings is because of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome was like a hot thing that lots of people talked about for a long, long time. And it kind of went away. But I had a long think about this. Why was imposter syndrome a thing? Imposter syndrome was a thing. Well, okay, just briefly, let's just kind of like lightly describe what imposter syndrome is. Essentially, it's something along the lines of, I don't actually know what I'm doing. How did I get hired for this job? What am I doing here? Why am I in this field? I don't know how to program. I don't actually know how to program. I'm just faking it till I'm making it. And there were so many attempts, so many articles, just lots of different attempts to determine why imposter syndrome was a thing. And I had to think about it for a long time. And I think I finally figured out, and it's actually really simple. Imposter syndrome was rarely a thing let's say 2000s, maybe even 2010s. You almost never, if ever, heard of imposter syndrome. But something between, let's say, 2010s and 2020s, somewhere in that range of time, I could be off by a few years, imposter syndrome suddenly became like you saw it a lot. Why? And I think the answer is because for some reason or another, in some forms or others, we leaned very much on adding complexity and abstractions because we were trying to solve problems. And as a result, people would sit down and they would do something like npm install or apt-get install or build something not really understand what was going on. They would just pull in whatever packages they needed to pull in. They would pull in whatever external dependencies they needed to pull in. It just did it for them. And then they would type a command and something magical would happen. And most people had no idea what was actually going on. And so they felt like imposters because they didn't actually know what was going on. And it's not to say that people, overall were dumb or stupid or whatever, but I do think there was a form of self-induced pain where people were just like, across the board, programmers to managers to executives were too lazy to actually care about the underpinnings of what they were doing. And so they would execute whatever it is they needed to execute, have barely any thought put into how or why something was running the way it was. All they had to do was look up a tutorial on, here's like your simple hello world get started, and then add features on top of that. But nobody actually knew what was going on. And even at an expert level, you had senior engineers who had been around for years, if not decades, feeling imposter syndrome. Why were they feeling imposter syndrome? Because they also didn't know what was going on. As expert as they may have been, they were also executing things with a whole bunch of dependencies. They didn't really know what was going on. And at some point, somewhere along the way, that bothered a lot of people. That bothered people so much that they felt like they were fakers, that they didn't really belong in the industry because what the hell were they doing? So all of this kind of leads back to developer experience and the fact that developer experience is very much dependent on how you feel. Because at the time, in a vacuum, it feels good to be able to run a simple command line and have a bunch of stuff happen and off you go to the races. It feels good. But when the metal hits the floor, or whatever the term is, when it comes down to, well, what am I actually doing here? You don't really know what you're doing, and your logical process steps in. And I think imposter syndrome is actually cognitive dissonance. That's what I think is actually going on. And I'm probably going to do an article about that, where I actually believe that imposter syndrome was cognitive dissonance on full display, where people's logical faculties and their emotional faculties were at odds, because emotionally they were feeling like the tools and experiences they were having as they were building whatever it is they were building felt great. But at some point along the way, their logical processes came in and said, wait, logically, can I step through how this works? Nope, I can't. And that's usually what happens to cult members. Cult members suffer from cognitive dissonance when their logical faculties are engaged and their logical faculties start screaming, hey, your emotions are not aligned with what I deem to be logical. And then they go, and at that point, you have to decide whether you're going to lean more towards your emotional framework or your logical framework. And that's a tough balance. A lot of people lean towards their emotional framework, though. And here's why. People lean towards their emotional framework because the emotional framework is much easier to deal with in real life. The logical framework is not. The logical framework is something along the lines of, you watch a lion kill a young baby deer, and your emotional framework goes, I feel terrible, right? Some people don't feel that way, but I'm just using that as an example, right? It's just an example of something you see in real life. But logically, you go, okay, well, in this situation, I mean, the lion has to eat something, right? What is it going to eat? Bugs, grass, right? So logically, you can follow through why the lion ate the young baby deer that's so cute and so, wonderful and whatever, but emotionally that doesn't feel good, right? And so what you do is, in order to avoid having things like responsibilities in life, or in order to avoid the realities of life because you're not comfortable with the reality that this has to happen or that I have to do something, your emotional portion takes over, and you choose that more often than not. Libraries, frameworks, abstractions, complexity, all of these things cater to emotions. And unfortunately, they cater to the lowest common denominator of programmers who function mostly emotionally. What I just want to be clear, what this means is that probably a lot of programmers actually have far more logical capability than they give themselves credit for. But unfortunately, the easy path out is usually emotional. Otherwise, cults would not even be as prominent as they are even to this day. In 2024, we have many, many cults that still operate in full force with lots of support, with lots of members. There are cults everywhere you look if you're just willing to look for them. And sometimes even if you're not, they're right in your face. Why would this phenomenon still exist in 2024 when we're ripe and abundant with logical information at our fingertips? Because as psychological creatures, we favor the emotional because it provides an easy button framework to deal with life. Your emotions can override your logic, and when logic says, hey, something's uncomfortable, your emotions go, it's okay, I'll take care of you. And I think that's actually what happened with imposter syndrome. It was cognitive dissonance from cult-like or full cult activities in full display, and nobody knew it. And I had to think about this quite deeply before I figured it out. I'm quite convinced that many, many people fell into a cult in the industry without actually knowing it. Now, that's not. I want to be clear that programmers are not the only people at let's say at fault, but it's not really at fault in all cases. But let's just go with that term for now. It's not just programmers who fell into this. Here's what else happened. Managers who are not necessarily executives, but more often than not, they answer to executives. Managers also fell into this trap, and they also gave themselves a level of complexity that was illogical, but gave them a sense of emotional comfort. So agile and lean methodologies, that was exactly managers not knowing how to deal with the logical fact that they did not understand what programmers in their teams were actually doing, and therefore they could not properly manage them. And when that executive came barreling down on them saying, why is the programming team not producing as we expect? Managers would go, I don't know. And so they needed to provide an emotional framework for themselves to feel good. This is another way that cults operate. So pause that for a moment. Cults like to give you a checklist. Cult leaders especially. So for example, a cult leader might say something like, I am the spokesperson for God. God speaks through me. I speak to God. Therefore, anything I say is as if God himself is speaking to you. As long as you do what I say, you are essentially doing what God says. Here are a bunch of checkboxes that you must fulfill throughout your daily life. And as long as you fulfill those checkboxes based on what I tell you to do, your life is going to be just fine. Don't worry about it. And that gives you a sense of emotional comfort that is unparalleled by anything that you could come up with from a logical perspective. And people gravitate to that. So now back to managers. What was agile methodology? It was exactly this. A bunch of checkboxes. As long as we meet the KPIs, as long as we meet the metrics, as long as our burn down chart looks correct, as long as you move that ticket from one point to another, as long as we mark it done, as long as we have story points, as long as we absolutely produce a fundamental list of checkboxes that I as a manager can do, then when the executive asks me why my programming team isn't producing, I can say, well, but I followed all these things. So I wash my hands of this. And it gives them emotional comfort. And then executives fell into the same trap as well, because all they saw was down the tree. They saw ways of giving everybody what they wanted. The developers wanted an emotional framework that they could feel better in. And so that was, well, give me my tools, please. Give me my abstractions and my complexities. Give me my command lines. Give me my, all these things. Not that they are in and of themselves bad, but that's the reason for them. It makes me feel good. And when developers feel good, productivity goes up, which in some cases is undeniably true. And in other cases, I think it's not as clear. And I'm about to get into that. And then at the manager level, the managers go, well, give me agile or things like agile, which have all been tried, in various different ways. And executives go, well, man, we can make everybody feel good. Really? We can make everyone feel good. And then as a result, we get like some short-term gains. Now, they didn't think it was short-term. They thought it would just be continual gains. It was just, we're going to set a new status quo. We make everybody feel good, and here's the new status quo. And that's not what happened. But executives bought into that. And it just so happened to flukishly work for short-term gains. And this is usually what happens in cults as well. Over the long term, if you ask anybody who's exited a cult, who has managed to successfully exit a cult, I think almost all of them will agree with me that there is always, in a vacuum, a short-term gain that you can point to in your life that lines up exactly with what the cult tells you should happen, and you feel good about that. So, for example, someone might say, if you pray hard enough, you'll get that job. So maybe the cult leader says that. Trust me, God told me if you pray hard enough, you'll get the job. And what you remember is the one time you prayed so hard, you got that job. And what you forget is the 99 times you prayed so hard and didn't get that job. And even then, there's an excuse for why that didn't work out. And it's usually something like, well, you weren't doing everything that I told you to do. That's just not what God wanted. That's not something you actually wanted then. You should question whether that's what you really wanted. There was a different plan. Insert any number of excuses for why it didn't work. That's exactly the same thing that happens with the entire my developer experience, my managerial experience, my executive experience, and the positives that came out of short-term gains. So for example, well, we made everybody do React, which means by enforcing React in our company, we were able to find lots of developers. We were able to pay them cheap because a lot of them were juniors, and all they had to know was React. They didn't have to know about the intricacies of JavaScript. Why would we pay a senior developer to know that when we can just hire a bunch of juniors at a much cheaper price and get all the features out that we need to? And then managers went, well, this is great because React has a bunch of guardrails and we can kind of follow that with our agile methodology. So we get a win. And then executives go, hey, that's great. We pumped out a bunch of features within a span of 6 months to a year. Look at our VC funding. And then we can exit. And then we get a bunch of money. And that means success, doesn't it? Doesn't a bunch of money mean that we were successful? And then users kind of, sort of, in a way, are like, yeah, okay, well, it just means that we get more product options. Am I really happy with the product and its features and its quality? Maybe not that much, but at least I got it. And everybody along the board just does this emotional, hey, look at the time it worked and not the time it didn't work. Because as I'm going to get into, when you look at things at a bigger picture and longer term, like for example, when you've exited a cult and you look back over the years that you've spent in that cult, you will see that more often than not, things were either A, illogical, or B, didn't work out the way it was promised to you, but you forgot about those until you left. Because you have these rose-colored glasses looking back. So overall, the entire concept of developer experience, I feel like it is valuable, and I'm going to try and be fair to it. I'm going to get into what is developer experience and why it does matter. But I don't think it matters in the way that everybody thinks it does. And that's what I'm going to try and delineate here.